What happens when a beloved acting legend sits down for what should be a friendly chat about his latest film, only to find himself face to face with one of the most disrespectful hosts in television history? In just 41 seconds, Carol McGiffin would utter the words that would not only end Michael Caine's interview, but destroy her own reputation in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The ITV studios were buzzing that Tuesday morning as the Loose Women panel prepared for what everyone assumed would be a delightful conversation with Sir Michael Caine. The 87-year-old acting icon had graciously agreed to appear on the show to discuss his new memoir and reflect on his incredible 7-decade career in Hollywood. What nobody could have predicted was that this routine interview would become the most talked-about television moment of the year. Carol McGiffin sat in her usual spot, flanked by fellow panelists Ruth Langsford, Janet Street Porter, and Coincidental Nolan. The atmosphere seemed relaxed as the cameras rolled, and the iconic Loose Women theme music faded out. Ruth Langsford, serving as the day's anchor, smiled warmly at the camera. Good morning, and welcome back to Loose Women. We are absolutely thrilled to be joined by the one and only Sir Michael Caine. Michael, thank you so much for being with us today. Michael Caine, impeccably dressed in a navy suit and looking every inch the distinguished gentleman, nodded graciously. It's my pleasure, Ruth. Always lovely to be here with you ladies. The interview began smoothly enough. Ruth asked about his new book, his early days struggling as an actor in London, and his thoughts on the current state of British cinema. Michael spoke eloquently about his journey from Maurice Micklewhite to becoming one of Britain's most cherished actors. His stories were engaging, his manner charming, and the audience was clearly captivated. You know, Michael said with that distinctive voice that had narrated countless films, when I started out in the 1950s, nobody wanted to hear a Cockney accent on screen. They said it wasn't posh enough. Wasn't right for leading men. But I persisted because I believed that working class stories deserved to be told too. Janet Street Porter nodded approvingly. And thank goodness you did, Michael. You opened doors for so many actors who came after you. That's very kind of you to say, Janet. I always believe that if you work hard and stay true to yourself, good things will come. Coincidental Nolan chimed in next. Michael, you've worked with some incredible leading ladies over the years. Who stands out as particularly memorable? Michael's eyes lit up. Oh, so many wonderful women. Maggie Smith, of course, in the recent films. Julie Walters, who is just phenomenal. Helen Mirren, Judi Dench. I've been incredibly fortunate to work with actresses who bring such intelligence and depth to their roles. It was at this point that Carol McGiffin, who had been unusually quiet up until now, decided to interject. There was something in her tone, a slight edge that the other panelists seemed to pick up on immediately. That's all very nice, Michael, but can we talk about something a bit more interesting? I mean, we've heard all these stories before. Ruth Langsford shot Carol a look that could have frozen water. The studio fell silent for a moment, the only sound being the quiet hum of the cameras. Michael Caine, ever the professional, simply raised an eyebrow and waited to see where this was heading. I'm sorry, Carol, but I'm not sure what you mean, Michael replied, his voice remaining perfectly composed despite the obvious rudeness of the interruption. Carol leaned forward, a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. Well, let's be honest here. You're nearly 90 years old, right? Don't you think it's time to step aside and let younger actors have their moment? I mean, how many more films do you really need to make? The other panelists looked absolutely horrified. Ruth Langsford's mouth fell open, Janet Street Porter looked like she wanted to crawl under the table, and Coincidental Nolan actually gasped audibly. The studio audience, which had been warmly receptive just moments before, fell into an uncomfortable silence. Michael Caine, to his credit, maintained his composure remarkably well. Carol, I'm not sure age should determine whether someone continues to work in a field they love. I'm still healthy, still passionate about acting, and thankfully, directors still want to work with me. But Carol wasn't finished. If anything, she seemed emboldened by the shocked reactions around her. But surely you must realize that you're taking roles away from younger actors who need the work more than you do? You've had your time in the Sunday. Ruth Langsford finally found her voice. Carol, I think that's quite enough. Michael is our guest and… No, it's all right, Ruth, Michael interjected, his voice still calm but now carrying a slight steel to it. Carol is entitled to her opinion, even if it's rather poorly expressed. Carol's face flushed red. Whether from embarrassment or anger, it was hard to tell. But instead of backing down, she doubled down on her attack. Poorly expressed? I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. These old actors hanging on way past their sell-by date. It's embarrassing, really. Janet Street Porter looked like she was about to explode. Carol, what on earth has gotten into you? This is completely inappropriate. Is it though? Carol shot back. I'm tired of pretending that everything these old has-beens do is wonderful just because they used to be famous. Michael Caine hasn't made a decent film in years. The tension in the studio was now palpable. Camera operators were exchanging glances. The floor manager looked panicked, and the other panelists were clearly scrambling to figure out how to salvage what had become an absolute disaster. Michael Caine sat quietly for a moment, his hands folded in his lap, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and dignified. Carol, I'm not sure what's prompted this hostility, but I came here today to have a pleasant conversation about my work and my life. If you're not interested in that conversation, perhaps it would be better if I left. This should have been Carol's cue to apologize, to backtrack, to somehow rescue the interview. Any reasonable person would have taken this graceful exit ramp that Michael had offered, but Carol McGiffin was about to prove that she was anything but reasonable. Instead of accepting the dignified way out that Michael Caine had offered, Carol McGiffin leaned back in her chair with a look of pure arrogance. Oh please, don't try to make me the villain here. I'm just being honest about what everyone else is too polite to say. Ruth Langsford was desperately trying to regain control of the situation. Carol, I really think we should move on and… No, Ruth, let her finish. Michael said quietly, his eyes never leaving Carol's face. I'd like to hear exactly what she has to say. Carol's smirk widened. She was clearly enjoying the chaos she had created. Fine. You want honesty? Here's honesty. You're a relic, Michael. Your acting style's outdated, your films are boring, and frankly, watching you try to keep up with modern cinema is like watching a pensioner trying to use a smartphone. It's painful and embarrassing for everyone involved. The studio fell into the kind of silence that feels like a physical weight pressing down on everyone present. Even the camera operators had stopped moving. Janet Street Porter's face had gone completely white, while Colleen Nolan sat with her hand covering her mouth in shock. Michael Caine remained perfectly still for several long seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. I see. And you feel qualified to make this assessment based on what exactly? Your extensive experience in the film industry? Carol laughed, a harsh sound that echoed unnaturally in the silent studio. I don't need to be in the film industry to recognize when someone has overstayed their welcome. I'm a television presenter, Michael. I know about entertainment, and you're not entertaining anymore. Carol, stop this right now, Ruth Langsford commanded, her professional composure finally cracking. This is completely unacceptable behavior, but Carol was in full flow now, seemingly intoxicated by her own cruelty. Am I wrong, though? When was the last time Michael Caine made a film that anyone actually wanted to see? The Dark Knight? That was over 15 years ago. Since then, it's just been one forgettable performance after another. Janet Street Porter finally found her voice. How dare you speak to Sir Michael like this? He's a knight of the realm. He's won 2 Academy Awards. Oh, here we go with the titles and the awards. Carol interrupted with a dismissive wave of her hand. That's all ancient history. What has he done lately that matters? What contribution is he making to cinema now besides taking up space that could go to someone with actual talent and relevance? Michael Caine slowly placed his hands on the arms of his chair, preparing to stand. I think I've heard quite enough. Have you? Carol challenged, her voice rising. Because I'm not finished. You want to know what I really think? I think you keep making films because you can't bear the thought of being irrelevant. You're clinging to fame like a drowning man clinging to driftwood, and it's pathetic to watch. The other panelists were now actively trying to intervene. Colleen Nolan reached across to touch Carol's arm. Carol, please, you need to stop this. Carol shook her off. Don't touch me, Colleen. Someone needs to say this. We're all supposed to pretend that everything these old actors do is wonderful just because they used to be good? That's not how the real world works. Michael Caine stood up slowly, his dignity intact despite the verbal assault he had endured. Ladies, thank you for having me. Ruth, Janet, Colleen, it's been a pleasure as always. But Carol wasn't finished destroying herself. That's right, Michael, run away. That's what people your age do when they can't handle the truth. You shuffle off and pretend the world still revolves around you. The studio erupted. Ruth Langsford actually shouted, Carol, while Janet Street Porter looked like she was about to physically restrain her colleague. The audience, which had been sitting in stunned silence, began to murmur angrily. Michael Caine paused, his hand on the back of his chair. For the first time since the assault began, his composure showed the slightest crack. You know, Carol, in all my years in this business, I've worked with some truly difficult people. Directors who screamed, producers who threatened, co-stars who were impossible to work with. But I have never, in 7 decades of professional life, encountered someone with such a complete lack of basic human decency. Carol's face flushed even redder. Basic human decency? You mean the kind that lets mediocre has-beens keep taking work from people who deserve it more? I mean the kind that shows respect for another human being, Michael replied, his voice growing stronger. The kind that recognizes that talent and experience have value. The kind that understands the difference between honest criticism and cruel personal attacks. Oh, spare me the lecture, Carol snapped. You've been coasting on your reputation for years. Everyone knows it. I'm just the only one honest enough to say it. Janet Street Porter had clearly had enough. You're not being honest, Carol, you're being vicious. There's a difference. Is there? Carol turned on Janet now. Or are you all just too scared to admit that the Emperor has no clothes? Michael Caine is finished. He just doesn't know it yet. It was at this moment that something shifted in Michael Caine's demeanor. The polite, diplomatic facade finally began to crack. Not from hurt, but from righteous anger. You want to talk about being finished, Carol? Let's talk about what you've just done to your own career. Carol McGiffin's smug expression faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. My career? Please, I'm not the one desperately clinging to relevance. Michael Caine smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had finally decided to remove his gloves. No, Carol, you're the one who just destroyed any credibility you might have had left. You see, I've been in this business long enough to recognize someone who's projecting their own insecurities. What's that supposed to mean? Carol demanded, but there was a slight tremor in her voice now. It means, Michael said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience, that anyone watching this will see exactly what you are. A bitter, failed presenter, taking out her frustrations on someone who actually achieved something with their life. The other panelists were watching this exchange with a mixture of horror and fascination. Ruth Langsford looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair, while Janet Street Porter and Colleen Nolan seemed torn between trying to intervene and watching Carol get what many would argue she deserved. Failed presenter? Carol's voice rose to a near shriek. I've been on television for over 20 years. And what do you have to show for it? Michael asked calmly. A few appearances on panel shows where your main contribution is being disagreeable? That's not a career, Carol. That's just being professionally unpleasant. Carol looked around wildly, as if seeking support from her colleagues, but found none. Ruth Langsford was staring at the floor. Janet Street Porter was shaking her head in disgust, and Colleen Nolan looked like she was trying very hard not to applaud Michael's response. You can't talk to me like that, Carol sputtered. Can I? Michael raised an eyebrow. You seem to think you can talk to me however you please. What makes you so special that the rules don't apply to you? I was just being honest about your work, Carol protested, but her earlier confidence was rapidly evaporating. Michael let out a genuine laugh, and it was somehow more devastating than any angry retort could have been. Honest? Carol, you haven't said a single thing about my work that demonstrates even the most basic understanding of acting or filmmaking. You've simply hurled insults like a child having a tantrum. That's not true, Carol said weakly. Isn't it? Let me ask you something, Carol. Have you actually seen any of my recent films? Can you name the last 3 movies I appeared in? Can you tell me anything specific about my performances that you found lacking? Carol's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The silence stretched on uncomfortably as it became clear she had no answer. I thought not, Michael said with quiet satisfaction. You see, ladies and gentlemen, this is what happens when someone confuses having opinions with having knowledge. Carol doesn't actually know anything about my work. She's simply decided that attacking me will somehow make her seem relevant and edgy. Ruth Langsford finally found her voice again. Michael, I am so sorry about this. This is not how we conduct interviews on this show. Michael turned to Ruth with genuine warmth returning to his expression. Ruth, you have nothing to apologize for. You and Janet and Colleen have been nothing but professional and courteous. This reflects on Carol, not on you or this program. Carol seemed to realize that she was now completely isolated. You're all ganging up on me now? Janet Street Porter finally exploded. Ganging up on you? Carol, you've spent the last 10 minutes verbally abusing our guest for no reason whatsoever. What did you expect would happen? I expected to have an honest conversation instead of the usual fawning nonsense. Carol shot back, but her voice lacked its earlier venom. Michael Caine picked up his jacket from the back of his chair and began to put it on. Carol, Let me give you some free advice from someone who's actually made a living in this business. Honest conversation requires honesty, not cruelty. It requires knowledge, not ignorance. And it requires respect, which is something you clearly know nothing about. Fine, Carol said desperately. Go ahead and leave. Prove my point that you can't handle criticism. Michael paused in putting on his jacket and looked directly at Carol. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the studio. Carol, what you did here today wasn't criticism. It was a public display of your own character, and frankly, it wasn't a very flattering one. He turned to the other panelists. Ruth, Janet, Colleen, thank you for a lovely morning. I'm sorry it ended this way. As Michael moved toward the exit, Carol made one final, desperate attempt to regain control. That's right, Michael. Walk away, just like I said you would. Michael stopped and turned back one last time. Carol, I'm not walking away from criticism. I'm walking away from cruelty. There's a difference, though I suspect you'll never understand what it is. With that, Sir Michael Caine walked off the Loose Women set with his head held high and his dignity completely intact. The cameras continued to roll, capturing Carol McGiffin sitting in stunned silence as the magnitude of what she had done began to sink in. Ruth Langsford looked directly into camera one. We'll be right back after this break. But everyone in that studio knew that some things couldn't be fixed by a commercial break. In 41 seconds of pure arrogance and cruelty, Carol McGiffin had revealed exactly who she was, and no amount of editing or explanation could change what the audience had witnessed. Michael Caine had walked into that studio as a respected actor and left as something even more valuable, a man who had shown grace under fire and reminded everyone what true class looks like.